today. Welcome to CODEstantine Meetup. Today with us we have Goran Ribic from Interventure. Hi, Goran.
So, hi.
As you all know, CODEstantine is the developers community that organizes tech events, meetups, and conferences. We're cooking up a big in-person conference for later in the year. So for all of you who have been waiting for quite a while now, get ready. It's going to get even better. So far, this is 14th virtual event, basically virtual meetup, which we started since the physical restrictions took place. So soon we'll be back live. But I'm super happy to introduce to all of you our today's sponsor, Interventure, a product development company assembling all-star engineering teams who build amazing software solutions for a decade now. They're a Swiss company that enables partners to build remote software development teams in their engineering hub in Belgrade, Novi Sad, and Niš, while giving their member engineers opportunity to work with amazing international companies, tackling global challenges. So modern technologies, exciting products that shape global industries, direct impact on product development, and no waiting on the bench policy. That's what Interventure is all about. And today with us, we have Goran Ribic, an experienced front-end developer with demonstrated working with computer software industry, .NET framework, HTML, JavaScript, JSON, ASP.NET. Goran, you have a bachelor's degree in mechatronics, robotics. So that sounds quite cool from the automation engineering from the Faculty of Technical Sciences in Novi Sad. You say that you're a fan of basketball, cycling, swimming, board games, and constructive talks. I'm really keen on finding out more about that. What's your number one board game you would recommend to all the people that they should definitely try out?
Well, you catch me up on that question. I didn't play a lot. For some quite time, I didn't play board games, but something like Mexico from the card games, that's something that I like. Most of my adulthood and earlier years I played. So that's something that I really enjoy playing. And besides that, I played many others, but can't remember their names.
I really like Five Tribes, for example, and recently I tried Munchkin, and I can recommend it to others.
Yeah, Munchkin is really
so
nice.
Go ahead and try those out. Cool.
I did.
At the moment, Goran is working as a senior front-end developer at Interventure and part of the Frontify team. Today, he's going to talk with us about React hooks. So specifically about UseEffect and its dependencies. And we'll dive in on some of the things you have experienced working with it and try to explain some of the kind of nitty-gritty stuff that some people often don't understand. So hopefully after this talk, it will be more clear for the people attending and how to use UseEffect and feel more comfortable with it. Before we go into the actual talk, and I leave the floor for you, a couple of operational information. So on the side, you will see a chat window. Feel free to comment your questions there. I will be monitoring the chat, and I will be jumping in and asking Goran questions, both the ones that I have and the stuff that you guys ask in the chat. So feel free, and we do encourage you to write as many questions as you want. Make sure to follow CODEstantine on all the social media and sign up for a newsletter, because soon we'll release a little bit more details about the in-person CODEstantine 6 conference. So 6th year in a row with just sixth event with just 1 year slipped in the last 7 years. So finally back online, we're all excited to get together and talk in person. Also make sure you follow No Limit Hub, an NGO that is behind CODEstantine and all the events. There's a bunch of cool projects happening for all of you out there. So make sure you follow that as well. And without further ado, Goran, feel free to share your screen and presentation and dig in.
Thank you. Just a moment. Do you see my screen?
Just a
Do you see the presentation?
Right now, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you for introduction and for having me, and also hi to everyone watching this. I hope you will enjoy what I have to present to you. So the topic is about UseEffect, and UseEffect is, well, kind of a new React API that come along, well, it's shipped in React 16.8, right? But before I talk about UseEffect, I would like to say something about myself. So my name is Goran. I worked as software developer for the past 5 years. I started as a full stack developer, but then transitioned as a front-end developer, and I'm currently working in Interventure as part of the Frontify team. Besides that, if you have any feedback or additional questions after this presentation, please just drop me a message on my email, rebits.goran@hotmail.com, as I don't usually am active that much on social media. Okay. So why React and why UseEffect specifically? Well, for the first question, why React? Well, React is kind of getting popular every day, each day by day, and it's kind of a mainstream now, I would say, and with a good reason, because React specificity and precision for presenting your application UI is quite good, and React in itself is quite fun once you figure it out how it works and its own concepts. And I hope this presentation will help you understand them more than you probably maybe know. And why UseEffect? Well, specifically, well, even though I'm going to talk about UseEffect, I'm also going to cover some concepts that UseEffect relies on, and I think it is a key to understanding UseEffect completely. Right. So UseEffect hook. What we know about, like, for now, common sense up to now. So if you probably worked React already and with functional components and you used some hooks, you probably use the UseEffect hook also. And first thing that you learn about UseEffect hook is that it's used for side effects, right? And what are the side effects? Well, the React documentation has a really good definition. Data fetching, setting up a subscription, and manually changing the DOM in React components are all examples of side effects, right? Pretty clear, right? Besides that, once you started using it, one of the most common cases that you used it is if you want to use it only once, you would put an empty array as its dependency. And what is dependency in this case? Well, the UseEffect has two dependencies. It's basically variables and functions that it uses. Besides that, maybe not that much common sense about UseEffect, but I think it should be known, is that it runs after browser paint. So what that means? It basically means that it does not block the updating of DOM, of UI, right? Unlike the previous API that React had with class components, right? And where we are on the subject of a class components, we can think of a use effect like from the React documentation, as it says here, as a component did mount, component did update, and component will mount lifecycle methods, but combined. So regarding all those key concepts that UseEffect relies on, I'm going to talk about React rendering, closures, and synchronization. And besides that, I think it's important to talk about UseEffect dependencies and its cleanup. And in the end, I would like to speak about some common cases when using UseEffect, for instance, like infinite loop. So on the first topic, how it renders. So here we have a component, simple component, which basically just renders how many times you clicked one button. And the question is, how does actually this paragraph know what count value is, right? Does it have some kind of watcher? Is it binded somehow, or it's some use state magic, right? So the thing is, it's none of those. It's quite simple. Use state just returns its value, and in this case a number, and it's 0, right? So const count is in this case just constant. It's stupid constant, right? And okay, but what happens if you, for instance, click again on that button and it updates state, right? Well, in that case, count will be 1. And what does that mean? So I will give you another example how that actually behaves. So here I have an example where we compare class as a functional component. So basically, class component is same as a functional component in its intent. In this case, it just shows what user passed as a props, like in this case, message, right? So after some time, after 2 seconds. But if we play this little demo, here initially we try to do that with the display message from functional component and change React to Angular, but we get I love React value. Interesting. And what if we do the same flow with the class component? In that case, we're gonna get the view. I love view. So even though that the intent of this component is the same, the behavior is not. So why is it like that? And also, before I speak about that, you should be always careful of those reasons when you want to actually refactor some old API like class components to new functional components, right? But why is this happening? What is the reason? Because basically this should be the same, right? Is it about props? Is it about something else? What is going on? Well, let's see an example with state, right? So here we have a dummy input component, which basically also just alerts what user typed in its input, right? So let's see a little bit demo. So if you type 1, 2, 3, 4 and click display button and then type something more, it actually shows 1, 2, 3, 4. And this is the case about functional components. Here I will not show the class component, as it behaves just the same way as in the previous example, where it will just show the latest updated state. So it will show all numbers from 1 to 9. But okay, it's not about state, it's not about props. What is the key difference here? What is happening? So regarding the class component, it's about this. So what does this mean? In this case, well, initially, what you learned about React, that props and state is immutable, right? That it should never change, like you should never mutate it. But in this case, this is actually mutable, and that's not specific to React. That's how it behaves. But React, in this case, about class component, relies on this to actually update. Okay, but this is only in class component. How does it is it handled in functional components in this case? What's happening there? where in functional component, it's about closures. So if you're not aware what closures are, or if you need a reminder, it's basically if you have some value that is defined out of the function, but that function uses that value, then that function will actually capture that value and hold it and have it also inside that function, right? So this is interesting concept when you think about functional components, and it's a key concept to understand when work with functional components, as UseEffect also relies on it. So, but what that actually means for functional components in general. So functional components, because of this, actually captures props, it captures state also, as we saw, even event handlers. And what about hooks? For example, UseEffects. Yes, it also captures UseEffects, and actually it captures everything. And one important part about this, when it captures on every render, right? So what that means? Let's see through example of using UseEffect. Here we have basically the same component count, but we're actually using a UseEffect in this case, which only just mutates the DOM, mutates the title. So initially, this state of count is 0, and it will render once, right? And how does that look? It looks like this. So what happens if we click once or second time button to update that state? Well, then it will behave like this. So this is the key concept, the mindset that you should always have when you're working with functional components and UseEffect in general. So what does this say? So this basically says that you should think of it like a movie with frames. Every frame has its own render, and every render, because of closures, has its own props, state, event handlers, UseEffects, and whatnot, everything, right? In this case, even though that we're talking about one UseEffect in one component, it's key difference that in every render, it's actually different UseEffect with its own values that it's used. Okay, so that's quite interesting and quite different from how the class components behave. But can we actually mimic the behavior of class components in functions? This is a little bit on a side, but it actually we can. Then we can only, and how we could do it, how, in what way can we do that? It's basically we need some mutable instance, right? We need some mutable instance to achieve that. And how we can achieve that is by simply using a useref hook. Using useref hook, when you read about useref, it usually says you can use it for mutating the DOM, updating, and whatnot. But in this case, we can also use it in functional component to behave like a class component to have the latest value at any render. So this is a little bit strange, but for instance, in first render that happened, we can actually read the latest value that happened in render 3. It's across all these frames, right? This state. And why we use UseEffect in this case? Well, it's to update that value, that mutable state, because what's the difference between class components and this approach is that in class components, React handles this for yourself, like updating props and state, and that's it. But here, you have to do it. And the best way to do it is by using a UseEffect in this case. Okay? That's basically it, all about rendering. Now, I would like to talk about UseEffect Cleanup, right? Because UseEffect can be used also to subscribe to something and then unsubscribe in that case. So you can have some UseEffects that have cleanup in itself. So I wrote here, it's all the same. So what I mean about that? For instance, let's say initially when we mount this component, it renders once, right, with friend ID for instance 5, and then how would you perceive it beforehand without knowing that about frames and rendering, is basically you would thought that this will happen in this order. So you update when the update occurs, for instance, the ID changes from 5 to 10, you assume that UseEffect will render this, call this cleanup before actually updating that second render where the ID is 10. But that's not actually how it behaves. And how it actually it behaves, it's basically like this. So React renders UI for ID 10. So for instance, when you update ID from 5 to 10, it will actually immediately render UI for that ID. Then the browser will paint that, and we can see that ID on the screen. And after that, React will actually clean up the effect that was from the initial render, right? And after that, will actually then run its own UseEffect. And this may look a bit strange, but when we think about the previous example where we had those frames, right, then we are aware of it, that all those frames has its own values. So basically, we don't mind where we're gonna call this cleanup, so we can actually call it after it, because it's actually capturing that value, and that value is 5. So it will always clean this subscription for that ID, right? Which is kind of a strange thing, but that's how it behaves, and that's really cool stuff to know, because if you think about lifecycle methods, the previous example will work in that case. It will actually do the mounting the component and calling that stuff, and then render all again, like sequentially. Like it's based on, let's say, time. That's why it's called lifecycle methods, right? So in all of these examples, I used UseEffect, and on every render, that UseEffect would actually be called, right? And with that we can have problems. For instance, we can have problems with optimization, because you don't want on every render to actually call that UseEffect. You can have many troubles. For instance, one of those troubles are infinite loops, right? So React figured out about that issue, know it, and then introduced something that's called dependencies. So in this case, when we don't want to actually call UseEffect on every render, we can specify its dependencies. And what will that dependency do? It will just basically compare its value render before and the updated render. And if it's the same, then UseEffect will not be called, right? But if it's changed, then it will call UseEffect again. And why is it done like this? Well, basically, because, for instance, in this UseEffect, we clearly can see that it's using count value. Why doesn't that UseEffect just know that it's using the count? Why do we have to specify it? Well, for UseEffect to actually know that it's using count, you have to call it, right? And if you call it, well, bad luck. It's already called, and that's it. You cannot stop. You cannot revert it, right? So that's why the UseEffect and React guys, when they implemented this, they will basically rely on us developers to specify and say, trust me, UseEffect, this is the dependency that you're using, and you should only update when I pass this value, right? And what does that mean? So basically, React has a huge trust on us to do that, but in the end, they actually introduced some rules regarding that, and this is the rules that I'm referring to here from the docs. It basically tells you when you are not behaving correctly, right? So if you omit this count, but you're using it, if you apply these rules in your project, then you will get notified, you will get error. And here it says it's recommended using, but I would say it's a must because it actually solves a lot of issues beforehand and bugs that are quite hard to catch because of that stale data. And okay, but what actually happens if we don't specify in this case this dependency? What if we behave? What if you, for instance, lie to our UseEffect? So here is our component line counter, for instance, where in it UseEffect actually uses interval. We are setting an interval, and then we are clearing that interval on a cleanup. And that interval does nothing but just sets the count to 1, right? And calls or logs that interval. And it does it on every second. So let's see the demo, what will happen once we actually call this component. So here we can see that our current count is actually 1, but the interval is called on every second. And this is the main reason and issue regarding this, is because the count is not updating, but it should, right? And why is it staying 1? Well, because of that same reason that we talked about on each render. When the UseEffect is called, it captures its values that's used in that component. So for instance, here we are using count variable, and we call this UseEffect only on an initial render when we specified this dependency array empty, and it will know, okay, my count is 0, right? So every time the interval is called inside that UseEffect, it will have the value 0, and 0 plus 1 will always give you 0, and that's the issue. So here you can have basically stale data. It's not, and this is gonna bite you down the road, trust me. So this is the reason why you should always, why you should not lie about your dependencies. You should actually put them. So, but for this example, what somebody can note is if we specify the dependency in this case. So for instance, if we put the count there, we will actually every time the count changes, set the new interval and clear the older one. So that can be a little bit tricky, and it's kind of not ideal solution in this case. But nevertheless, it's better to do that than to leave the empty dependency array and use some variables that is depending on. So for this example, let's see how we can actually not lie about our dependencies, but solve this issue correctly. So the right way you can do it, well, I already mentioned, you can just specify the count dependency, but there is also another way. You can make UseEffect self-sufficient. So we don't have to pass that count, because useState has its own feature where you can actually pass the function there, which actually gives you the current count. And in that way, you're avoiding having a dependency in it, because the count in this case is passed from useState. And then in that case, you can leave this empty array, and you will be fine with it, right? So in case the interval will be only set up once, and it will be cleared once, and that's it. Cool. Is there any other way? There is kind of a catch with useReducer hook, and how this actually behaves. It's by passing dispatch function. And React states that dispatch functions, you can pass them as dependency or not. It depends on you, and if it's fine if you don't pass it also. And the reason is React guarantees that dispatch will not change through every render, right? So, but how dispatch works? In what way does this not affect UseEffect in a way as it does the count, right? Well, dispatch works with the actions, right? So you just define the action that's going to happen, and outside of, for instance, a line container, you can define your reducer and your state and what will happen on that action, right? In that way, we made the UseEffect also self-sufficient, and it doesn't rely on any dependency. Okay, so so what about infinite loops? So in this case, I'm talking here about infinite loops, but this applies across multiple cases, I would say. So for instance, we have here a function function component product list, which it has its own state. It has some async function for fetching those products, and use the fact that it's using that fetch products, right? And we can assume it's not written here, but that this use effect actually sets its own state when the fetched products happen, right? So in this case, we did not specify any array, and this is how we actually go to the infinite loop, because we fetch the products, we set the state updates its render, updates the component, we change the render, and we have a new use effect that also runs because state changed, and it goes into loop, and that's how you get memory leak. So, but what you can do? Well, most of us, when we started using use effect, we will just pass an empty array, and that's it. We know that it behaves like componentDidMount, and that's it, right? In this case, it's workable. You can use it like this, but it's not the best solution. There's much better ways how to handle this. For example, if we, for instance, have these fetch products outside the use effect, and it does not rely on any state or props, then we can simply just hoist that function outside of our component. And if you do that, then that will work. It's cool because you can also then reuse that function, not just on that component, but on many components, right? That's how we define helpers or utility classes or whatnot, right? But also, why do that? Why just not leave it there? Well, for instance, if this fetch products, for example, has a lot of code in itself, let's say 200 lines of code, and it does not use any state or props, then it's fine also. But once you introduce, for instance, some other state that it relies on or props, it's hard to catch right in that large of function that that you cannot easily spot it, and that fetch products it tries on that props or state, and then we use that function in our use effect, and then our use effect also relies on that state of props. So to tackle this problem, what would we usually do is actually define this async function is inside our use effect. So even if that scenario happens, you can immediately know that I'm using it in this use effect and just add it as a dependency, for instance, right? And then that solves the problem. And this is the most preferred way I would say to do it, if you can. But if you can't, for instance, if you use these fetch products in multiple places, for instance, you have one use effect that uses it, another use effect that uses it, then you cannot do that unless you copy paste the code, right? And that's not a good thing, right? So how to solve that issue? Well, then we rely on something that React provides to us, and that's use callback hook or use memo when it refers to objects. And what that does, it actually same as the use effect when you have the dependencies, it memoizes your function. Actually, it saves from re-rendering if it doesn't need to re-render. So when you use callback, and for instance, we had some state that fetch product relies on, we will pass that state as a dependency in itself, and in that way, then our function is part of data flow, right? Why not always use this? Well, for instance, it's better to use the second approach with async function, because use callback are kind of inexpensive. They can be a bottleneck if you reuse it too much, right? So you should always try to avoid, try to solve it in another way. But if you cannot, then just rely on use callback, right? Okay, and some additional tips when it comes to the dependencies. As I talked earlier, the UseEffect dependencies usually compare, right? And let's see if the count is 0 and 0, then it will not re-render, and if it's 0 and 1, then it will re-render. But it's not just on value. The comparison goes with reference also. So, for instance, if you have some dependency like object that has, for instance, type, name, and whatsoever, but our effect only uses some part of that object, for instance, in this case, product type, then we should just pass that, and we solved with the reference problem, right? Another tip that I want to give is JSON stringify. If you have nested object, but this should not be used lightly. This is like if you go this approach, this is basically a temporary thing, because in this way, this is a hack for dependencies, as you actually just stringifying your object, and then you're just comparing strings, and you're done with the reference, and that's fine, and it works. But React will not recognize that as a valid dependency. Like, you ask you to actually put the nested object, but of course we are aware that it's the same object, and React relies on us that we say this is good, then we can use it. But usually there is a preferred way to use to solve this, right? Okay, so this is all regarding the cases that I have regarding the dependencies and the use effect. And something that I mentioned here already is about flow data. And I would like to end this talk with that, and to end with the one of concepts that UseEffect relies on, and that is synchronization. So in this case, when we specify those dependencies, we are making that effect part of that data flow. What that means? So that means that we can actually use UseEffect and synchronize everything outside of React, a tree based on those props and states. So what does this mean? What does this say about synchronization? So even though that UseEffect mimics componentDidMount and component update and component will amount, it does not rely on those lifecycle methods. The concept is completely different. It's not about the journey, but it's about the destination in this case. And synchronization just needs to know the end result. And UseEffect relies on that. So I would say that is all from my side. What I would like to say before I finish is that this talk was inspired by Dan Abramov's blog. If you don't know who Dan is, he is, well, the creator of Redux and one of the developers currently working in React. So, and I would encourage you to actually go and read about his blogs, as the best way to learn something new is actually if you do it yourself. And that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Goran, for sharing these details about UseEffect and React hooks. Definitely a new way of developing in React, as we have also kind of transitioned from the typical class components to functional components. It's a little bit different paradigm, and like it's not the typical procedural programming, but it's not the class based. So like it looks a little bit like we're going in circle in terms of like how technology is developing and what's becoming hip and trendy. So thanks for sharing all this. I would encourage everyone to ask questions in the chat. We'll try to answer a couple of them. And also after this session, or you can go to the expo area where you can chat with the staff from Interventure if you want to learn more about their company, what they do, their open positions. After this, you can feel free to go there and get to know them a little bit better. So we did have a question. I'll show it here. So Stefan asked, uh, in which case should we use layout effect in our application instead of use effect?
Okay, so well, use effect you should usually use 99% of the time, as use layout effect has specific case, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that use effect is called after the browser paints. In this case, use layout can be used to actually do something beforehand. I personally haven't used it that much, but that's the main goal of it.
Cool. So we also
Does that
have, I guess so. If Stefan, you want to us to dig a little bit deeper, feel free to follow up on the question in the chat. We also have a question with functional components and hooks being so advanced. Is there any more reason to work with class-based components rather than maintaining legacy code?
Personally, I would say no, because everything is going to the direction of hooks. And what I forgot to mention, and it's something interesting about use effect, it should be a low-level hook. So what we'll see in the future is basically using that use effect hooks and coming up with an abstraction that is specific. For instance, you can use that use effect to create a hook for fetching, and you will call it use fetch, and so on and so on. So it's much more reusable in that way, and yeah, that's how React community is going that direction. So other than maintaining legacy code, I would not personally use class components.
So if that's the way to go, so how would you recommend to take on like a big legacy application which is built in a class-based React component style? So what would be your advice how to tackle it, that transition from class-based to
Well, personally, like the best solution is to leave it in that way, because it's not, there is nothing wrong with your application being based on class components, right? So like if you can, just leave it as it is, and if not, then you have to do it step by step, like from bottom up, and be careful with it. You should always have tests for it, so you have to, if the test pass, that's like thumbs up that you're doing right stuff, right?
So which tools do you use for tests on front end to ensure that the code is that
currently, yeah, currently we are using Cypress. So even for like Cypress end-to-end tests, integration tests, and for unit tests. Beforehand, I used Jest and Enzyme, if I remember correctly, but it was quite long ago, like a few years ago. So it's ancient to me. But yeah, like what is good also regarding the test is the snapshot test that React provides. And that's basically what gives you is that test-driven development, right? It's red, green, red part where you would actually create something, and then once you make that snapshot, it passes of that component. When you change something, it will break. Then you have to validate, is that the change that you expected, and if it's yes, then you again save that as a snapshot, and so on and so on.
Cool. Anything else that you think might be useful to mention while we're on the topic of hooks that maybe was not part of the presentation, but that you want to highlight?
Not really. I mean, I like what I have to say is like the talk was inspired by Dan Abramov's blog, so I would encourage you all to go and read that, because that will level up your React knowledge quite significantly, I would say. And besides that, also because this was actually my first talk ever to give me some kind of feedback what I could do better. And yeah.
So guys, feel free to show some encouragement in the chat. I'm sure Goran will appreciate it. For congratulations, we're so honored to be the part of your first official public talk. Hope there will be more, maybe even in the in-person CODEstantine conference later in the year. Thank you very much for this presentation. Yeah, you're seeing the claps, so getting a lot of love from the community. I want to thank you and
Thank you.
for helping us organize this meetup, and of course for everyone out there. If you're interested, you can drop by the expo booth of Interventure, and we see you all on the next CODEstantine event organized by No Limit Hub.
Great. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you. Peace.
Bye.